Hey folks, so welcome to Chapter 6 lecture. This is a lecture on the Chapter 6 JavaScript textbook. The title of the lecture is How to Script the DOM with JavaScript. And we have not introduced this word, the DOM, before, and so we're going to learn what it is and how it works. I always like to take a chapter and talk about why it's important. A lot of what we've learned so far in JavaScript, as far as some of the basic control structures like if statements, if else, and loops, and where the semicolons go, the syntax of the language and case sensitivity. And we've learned a lot of the fundamentals of how to write the language, but we really haven't used JavaScript to really change much about the HTML or change much about the CSS. And so, when anytime you're studying this, what we call vanilla JavaScript, which is what this is, kind of like the JavaScript that's been around forever. Anytime you're studying vanilla JavaScript, one of the things you're going to read over and over and over again, or you'll hear over and over and over again, is that JavaScript makes your HTML or makes your web page dynamic. And dynamic's a big keyword there. You hear that over and over again. JavaScript makes your HTML dynamic. And so, um, where you once had a static web page that was not responsive to the user, now JavaScript can respond to the user and change what that web page has on it. And I gave a lot of examples before of ways that JavaScript can change the page. Um, Image sliders are a good example of that because, we worked with a lot of HTML already, and, we had these different various image sliders, and someone wrote a block of code, JavaScript most likely, to get that functionality. And you and I might visit the same web page, but use it differently, right? So it's a dynamic experience, and so you might scroll to the right, and I might scroll to the left. I might not scroll at all. Another example of a dynamic web page that's commonly used JavaScript would be form validation. And so anytime you register for a new site, you put your username, your password, you confirm your password, where do you live, give me your credit card number. Oh, you forgot your city. You forgot, you left this blank. And so you're going to get a little red error message that said, you didn't fill this out correctly, and that's JavaScript. So um, a lot of times calculations are done on the client side, and so it's like calculate shipping and handling. You can do some of that work on the client side, and so JavaScript is used to make dynamic web pages. There's a bunch of different ways that it can be utilized. Those are just a few of the common examples. And so what we're learning in this chapter is really how to change your HTML and really how to change your CSS. And so if the whole point of learning JavaScript is to learn how to make dynamic web pages, then this chapter is the whole point of what we're learning right now. So it's massively important. It's very critical to understand what the DOM is and how we work with the DOM to make our web pages dynamic. And so, kind of, I do want to look at these objectives real quick. What is the use of the DOM? So, what is the DOM and how do we use it? We're going to look at a bunch of properties of the DOM that are going to basically enable us to do exactly what I just got done saying. These properties enable us to change our web pages, make them dynamic. And you'll see a little bit more about that. And there's actually a lot of properties there. If you look at this, node value, parent, child, first child, last child. And so you're probably gathering that we're going to be working with relationships of our HTML elements. And just like we did in CSS, you can work with HTML based on its relationships of all these elements. And then next element sibling. So these are properties. Remember, we talked about the difference between properties and methods. Properties are pieces of data. Methods are more behaviors. And so methods always have parentheses after them. Properties are typically followed by no parentheses. And if you're assigning a value to the property, you would put the equal sign after it. And that's if you're putting something into the property. Anyways, we look at some of the methods. We've been exposed to getElementById, and we call that our JavaScript selector. It's a way that we can select our HTML from JavaScript. Well, as it turns out, there are other selectors in JavaScript. GetElementById isn't the only selector. And here you can see a few other selectors. GetElementsByTagName, GetElementsByName. So there's tag name, like the paragraph tag. There's by name, which is the name attribute in your HTML. And then GetElementsByClass name, which is the class attribute. So those second two, by name and by class name, those are attribute values. And then GetElementByTagName, that's the actual tag itself. In which case, if you're saying GetElementsByTagName and then you're selecting the paragraph tag, there's probably more than one paragraph tag. And so we have to learn how to deal with that when you select multiple of the same kind of element. We'll get into that a little bit. Let's see, a few more methods there. Has attribute, get attributes, we'll get into all that. And then bullet number 5, I want to point out a little bit about bullet number 5 is that bullet number 5 is called the Dom Html specification. And so you'll also see when compared to the DOM Core Specification. And so you can kind of see there's some things to compare there. The DOM HTML specification versus the DOM Core Specification. So we're going to start off this lecture talking about the DOM Core Specification, which I'm assuming this because I've never actually looked into it, but I'm assuming that the core specification is kind of the older, more antiquated way of scripting the DOM, whereas the DOM HTML specification is a little bit newer / easier. So we're going to learn two approaches, the old way and the new way, essentially, of working with the DOM. And you know, one's going to be easier than the other, but that doesn't mean that the other, the one that's a little bit harder, doesn't mean that it's not relevant, because there are pieces in the DOM core specification that don't transfer over to the DOM HTML specification. So they're both important for that reason. They're not completely interchangeable. Then we're going to work with forms a little bit more. We've been working with forms, and so 6, 7, and 8, 9 are all about working with HTML forms, and really we've been doing a lot of that. So, and then 10, describe the process of adding nodes with the inner HTML method. And so we have used inner HTML a little bit. We're just going to review that then. Okay. So, important chapter, you know, get your coffee this morning, get your notes, and you know, stretch, and let's go. So you take an HTML, so let's start this out. You take an HTML document like here on slide 4, and pretty simple HTML document starting at the top. You know, you got the head, then you got the body. Inside of the body, you got a heading, and then underneath the heading, you got a form. The form has an action which redirects the page to a join HTML. There's a label, a text box, and a span tag called email error. And back when we were in HTML, I covered the concept of it's important to start looking at your HTML and visualizing it as a tree-like structure. So it's an upside down tree, because trees start off thin at the bottom and then they widen at the top, whereas this is an upside down tree. It starts off thin at the top and widens at the bottom. And so when you look at this HTML page as this upside down tree-like structure, you say, okay, well, inside of the HTML tag, you have a head and a body. Inside of the head tag, then you have a title tag. And inside of the title tag, you actually have a little bit of text. Okay, same thing kind of going down this other branch of the tree from HTML to body. And then from the body, you go into your H1. And then the H1 has a little bit of text. And so we're starting to see that, at least in what this picture, which let's draw this out because I did skip ahead. So what we're looking at is a tree-like structure. This tree-like structure is what they call the DOM. DOM stands for Document Object Model. Okay, so let's break the DOM down into what we're looking at here. Okay, because you're going to hear this term, like if and when you guys get into this industry, if and when you're writing JavaScript, the DOM is synonymous with writing JavaScript. So you're going to hear this term, the DOM, all the time. So I think it's really important to understand anytime someone says the DOM, what are they talking about? And the way that I began to understand the DOM is this. The DOM, like at the simplest form, a model is a picture. I mean, we're looking at a model. And so I begin to understand what the DOM is by thinking of it as a picture. What is it a picture of? It's a picture of the document. Well, what do you mean the document? Well, in JavaScript, the document refers to the HTML that you've written, and that is being specifically the HTML that's loaded into the browser. Okay, because the web browser, Google Chrome, if we go back to our HTML basics, what happens? The client says, sends a request to the server and says, give me a web page. The server then responds with the HTML. That HTML document then is rendered by the browser. And what is rendered? It puts it into the computer's memory, and it draws the picture on the screen. And so when that HTML document is put into your computer's RAM, then it can modify that HTML document. Okay, so anytime you hear the DOM, realize the DOM is just a visual picture. It's a way to visualize. Okay, it's a way to visualize through a picture the HTML that's loaded into the browser window. And that's what the DOM is. Now, obviously, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, you forgot to explain the objects. Well, the objects are the individual, what they call nodes. And so, and you're saying, well, wait a minute, what's a node? It's the individual piece. Like this head is an HTML element. So this is an element node. The HTML is an element, right? If we go back here, there's an HTML tag. HTML tag begins here, ends there. This HTML is an element node. Body node, this is an element node. Form node, span node. This is, as you might guess, this is not an element, but this is a text node. Okay, so again, I think when you hear DOM and you're like new to JavaScript, I think it can be intimidating. The word itself, DOM, but I think if you break it down, it's really not too bad. Okay, it's a visual representation. It's a picture that's used to, it's a picture of the HTML that's loaded into the browser. And what that picture is a tree structure, upside down tree structure of individual nodes or pieces of the picture. Okay, and so when we come to nodes, there are various types of nodes, and so when we boil down to it, we're changing the DOM. We're changing these pieces of our HTML document to make our web page dynamic. If you change the text that's in an H1, then you're making your web page dynamic. When the web page loads, the H1 says one thing, and then when the user interacts with the page, they click buy the item, the H1 changes and says, thank you for your purchase. So that's an example of what taking a static web page and making it dynamic by changing the DOM, by using JavaScript. Okay, so I did use this term of a node. Okay, and most of these on this picture, each individual piece is a node. Okay, now I guess the other part that's kind of confusing about the DOM is that it's very abstract in the sense that you really don't see the DOM unless you draw it. Like, unless you take the time to get out a piece of paper and sketch down this hierarchy, the DOM is completely invisible to you. Just realize that when you're coding JavaScript, these different pieces that you're coding are changing the document, which is is changing your HTML. So the DOM is, I guess, mostly, fairly invisible for the most part, unless you draw it or maybe you use some software that'll draw it for you. I guess that's another part of it that this term can kind of be confusing, because short of this slide number 5, or when someone's explaining it to you, or unless you draw it out, you're not really going to see this picture all too often. Okay, but it really is useful when it comes to teaching this a little bit. Okay, so when we look at the different kinds of nodes that are part of the DOM, well, on this slide right here, there's really only 2 nodes. There's only 2 types of nodes. The first being element nodes, and so all of these in blue are element nodes. And so any HTML element is therefore an element node. And so when we look here at slide 6, you can see the second one on the list there is our element nodes. We also have text nodes. Okay, and you can see that again there's a relationship here. The text node is a child of its label. And so if we go here and we look at the label right here, okay, so the thing that I had to wrap my head around when I was first learning this is that this piece of text right here is its own node. So what goes inside of the tag is its own node. And so this word email address is a child of the label element. And the label element then is a child of the form, and the form is a child of the body. And so you can see that in this picture. You got form, label, and then the text. Of course, anytime you've got parent-child, oftentimes you have siblings. And so label and input and span, these are 3 siblings. They're on the same hierarchy. They all have the same parent. Okay, what you don't see on this picture is the document node. Okay, and what the document node is, the document node, again, what is the document? The document is your HTML that's being loaded into your computer's RAM. And so when you see the document, it's not really on here. It's really the parent of the HTML element. And so there's a document node that really could be drawn above this HTML. And the document really is only allowed to have one child. And so the one child of our document is the HTML tag. But it's not really shown here in this picture. But you can envision that the document node is the parent of HTML. And then the last piece here would be an attribute, ATTR. And that would be to say that this input tag has some attributes, has a type attribute, an ID attribute, and a name attribute. And so these attributes are also going to be useful in the sense that what we wind up doing with them, you can kind of imagine what we're going to do is we're going to change the text node. We're going to change the attribute values. And so by changing the text and by changing the attributes, we're making our HTML dynamic. And so there's an attribute node that can also be pictured in the DOM. Now, if it's a node, there are some properties that you can apply to it. So these are your 4 kinds of nodes, and these are all nodes right here. And these are all properties that we can work with. Inner HTML being the one that's most common. I shouldn't say most common. Inner HTML is really the only one that we've worked with so far. And so maybe it's most familiar to you. And so maybe we can just start coding a little bit of this. And I think I'm going to do several code demonstrations, and I think there's some even in the PowerPoint, but let me go ahead and launch my code editor. me zoom in on this a little bit so you guys can see this. Let's see. View. Maybe Control Plus. There we go. That's better. I had to do a reinstall, or not a reinstall, I had to do a reset. So what we've done so far, we've done stuff like this, where we get element by ID, some div, and dot inner HTML. And again, this is a property, right? So properties do not have the parentheses. Instead, we can do something like we can assign a paragraph, insert this paragraph. And this is being done when the page loads. There we go. So real simple stuff, right? So we've got a div with an ID on it. You know, this page is going to load top to bottom. There's no events on this page, so the first thing the HTML is going to do is it's going to, you know, it's going to put this div into memory. And then we found some JavaScript, so the JavaScript engine takes over, and it's going to look in memory, and it's going to say, oh, I got this thing called some div. And we're going to directly be able to insert some HTML into it. And in this case, I add in a little paragraph. And so what do we have here? We've selected an element. So the element node, in other words, we've selected this element. So therefore in our DOM, this is a node, this is a div node. Okay, and because it's a node, we can work with the node properties. And again, any one of these are nodes. And so these are all node properties, such as inner HTML. Now, inner HTML lets you add HTML inside of this tag. And so the result, if we inspect, you're going to see a div, and then inside of the div, you see the paragraph. And so, you know, we've done this so far. You know, really nothing should be new at this point. Just wanted to cover that we've kind of already been doing a little bit of this, specifically with inner HTML. But I just want to, you know, kind of one piece at a time and go through these different pieces. Now, node value. Node value is going to be used instead of targeting a div. Let's just put a paragraph here that has some text, because node value is going to be that text. This is the text. Okay. we're going to target this paragraph, some para, sure, some. Now, going back to our DOM, if we have a paragraph, there's actually a child node that's its own element. And so part of the thing that is important to learn that kind of took me a second is that if you're going to select the actual text, you need to target the child. So this paragraph, we're targeting the paragraph here, but we need to target the child. Well, luckily, how do we target the child? We do so with this first child. So keep in mind, so first child is going to be the text node. So when we select first child, let's come back here. First child. Now we've selected the text node dot node value. Okay, and you can kind of see this example. We're doing the same kind of thing as what they did right here. Now I'll talk about the difference between what's on this slide and what's on my slide. So here we're targeting a paragraph. The paragraph itself is a node. And so what we need is the child node, because a text is a node element in itself, and then changing the node value. So loading this up. And right when the page loads, it never said this is the text. Right away, it changed it. Of course, you take what we learned last chapter when we learned how to do things on events, and now we know how to change text that's already on the page. When you combine this with an event, because right now there's no events. Right now it's just really being done when the page loads, kind of top to bottom in memory. So we just demonstrated first child, and we demonstrated node value. Parent node, child nodes, last child. I will tell you some of these are more used in this class than others. And so things like that we've already covered, node value is a good one to know. First child we used, as well as next element sibling. These two paragraphs are siblings. And so if I were to load this page, I need this to open up over here. Okay, we're still changing the first one. This is some other text. Instead of, let's target the paragraph, and then let's do dot next element sibling. And email address, no, dot node value. So we're targeting the paragraph. Of course, I botched this. Let me find my mistake. We're targeting the paragraph, this guy right here. Next element sibling.
Don't you have to target the child instead of target the text?
Dot first child, thank you, sir. First child. So what I was doing was I was targeting the parent of the paragraph, and you need to target the child, which is the text node. So instead of, let me undo what I just did. So next element sibling, target the paragraph. This is a good mistake to make because I make it, odds are you'll make it too. What's the mistake? The mistake is I targeted the paragraph, not the text node that is a child of the paragraph. So I targeted this paragraph, then I said next element sibling, which brings us to this paragraph. I then need to do dot first child dot node value. And actually that's exactly what they had in this slide. And then we see, change it up. There we go. So that's a common mistake that I made. I'm glad that I made it, because you can see that even someone who's done this several times for many years now can still make a common mistake. Now, what I've been doing is a write operation, which means you are writing something into the HTML. And what goes on the left of the equal sign is always what's changing. And so here's our equal sign, and what goes on the left is what's changing. What's changing is the node value of the first child, of the sibling, of this paragraph. So this is what's changing. Well, the other way of doing this, the other type of operation, is a read operation. And so a read operation, the idea is that you could store information in a variable, and then you could change the variable, and then you could update the page based on that change. And so let's do a read operation. Let first name equals I'll put my name in a little text box here. Give this text box an ID of text first name. Okay, so you can see when the page loads, it's just putting my first name into a text box. And this is kind of just hitting on a fundamental. This isn't really on a slide, but this is just hitting on something that what I put here on line 17. What goes on the left of the equal sign is always what's changing. That's something that I see not being understood at this point. So list first name equals document dot get element by ID text first name dot value. So here what's changing is the first name variable, and what we're changing it to is whatever is in the text box. And then what I could do is I'll say first name plus equals, I'll put my last name, and then matter of fact, I'll just put that in a little pop-up window. So when this loads, you can see what I did was I read my first name from the text box. I changed it by appending my last name to it, and then I outputted it via an alert. Okay, so that's kind of your order of operations. That's kind of common commonly what's done. You might say, well, why would I just read off of the HTML document? Well, you read off of the HTML document to then maybe do some math with it, or maybe make some changes to the information, and then you could provide output with the results, or the output of the modified information. Okay. Now, to hit on these other pieces here, parent node, child nodes, last child, first child, there's really two pieces here when you're talking about these properties. Inner HTML and node value, we were using inner HTML and node value to assign something to it, like node value equals something. So some of these properties are more used, like first child. First child is more used as a navigational property, meaning it can take you from one part of the DOM to another part of the DOM. And so I think that it's good to point out that on this slide, here on slide 7, some of these properties are used to actually modify the document. Some of these properties are used to navigate the DOM. And so inner HTML used to modify, for example, the DOM. Whereas first child used to navigate the DOM, right? So all these ones about children and parents, not that you'll necessarily, not like there's a test question on this or anything, but I'm just pointing out the difference because it's a worthy thing of noting. So what are we doing here on slide 9? Well, slide 9 is a read. Remember, there's read and write operations. We're reading the email error text box. Now remember the $sign function that replaces. So anytime you see the $sign, remember that just replaces document get element by ID. So this is what it could be replaced as. We're getting the ID of email error. We're then going to its child and getting its node value. Well, what's email error? Going back into our document here, email error is the span, and the first child is the text inside of that span, and then the node value reads the star. So essentially what we've done on this line of code is we've stored the star inside of a variable called error text, right? So it's essentially doing that. That's what that line of code reads and puts it into that variable. And you go, well, again, why are we doing this? Well, the whole point of reading off of the DOM is to then utilize that variable somehow. We're not really showing the full picture. We're not showing what you do here, but we will get there, but it's just on this slide, we're just kind of step 1 of a multi-step process. This is the same thing. Let's target that email error span. Let's target the child node and change it to say entry is invalid. That's exactly what we did in my little code example. And then the same thing with the next element sibling first child node value. anytime you walk away from this, if you don't write JavaScript every single day, that is an easy thing to forget. I will tell you that the text elements themselves are nodes, therefore they are children of the elements. Okay, so we're 45 minutes in. It's a good time for a break. I'm going to pause. Okay, couple of new methods here, and hopefully by this point you're comfortable with document get element by ID. And so it's the document object, the document node, you can call it either one. Get element by ID is a method that belongs to that. But these methods, like get element by ID, they could also be applied to any element. So if you select an element other than document, like a div, for example. Anyways, inside of a div, you could target something inside of a div by its ID, get element by ID inside of a div. Let me demonstrate these other methods because here's a big difference. The big difference between get element, singular, by ID and get elements, plural, by tag name is just that. The one is targeting an individual element, and the others that we're learning here are potentially targeting multiple. And so what happens when you target multiple elements is you have to then realize that you're selecting many elements. You're not just selecting one. And that we learned a structure for storing multiple pieces of data. And that structure is an array. And so here we've got our three paragraphs, and let's do document dot get elements, and obviously these are plural, right? So we're going to target all these elements, and we'll say let I just want to demonstrate what this is doing. uh, Actually it shows an object node list, and it probably needs us to put in a breakpoint and actually to inspect it a little bit more. So if I put in a breakpoint here on line 16 and I refresh the page and I click next, we could see that it's a list. It's basically multiple items stored in a list. Somewhere down in here, I should be able to dig into, oh boy, for each. No. Somewhere in this hierarchy of information, I can dig down and see each individual paragraph. I don't know where it is to see. So that's not working out the way I want to. So the point being is that you typically don't work with it like this because when you're selecting multiple elements, you're storing this in an array of information. And when you're working with arrays, most of the time you're working with a loop. And so I put my loop like this. Basically, however many paragraphs there are, we're going to start off I at 0, and we're going to loop through the number of elements that are stored inside of paragraphs. In this case, we know that there's 3 paragraphs, so you could code it like this, while I is less than 3, so our loop will be 0, 1, and 2. But this is a little bit more dynamic in nature, in that if our paragraphs grow, and I add a 4th paragraph, then this code becomes a little bit more dynamic in nature and it can grow with it. So now we're going to loop through and we're going to use node value. So why don't we do an alert paragraphs sub I. So this will be the first paragraph in the loop, paragraph sub I dot first child dot node value. So let's think about what we're doing here. We're storing multiple paragraphs in an array because that's what this method returns. It returns an array of paragraphs. So it returns, in this case, 4 paragraphs and stores it in this variable called paragraphs. Now this is an array, so we can loop through that array and pop out the first paragraph, first child, which is this piece of text, and read the node value and pop it up in an alert. And if we inspect, refresh the page, okay, so it skipped my loop because you can see the paragraphs.length is returning 0. So I do have a bug, full of bugs this morning, which is fine because it's a learning experience for you guys to see my bugs. Why is the length 0 when I select get elements by, oh gosh. You can't see me unless you're watching the video. I just hung my head low. I've done this before too. What's the difference between get elements by name and get elements by tag name? Well, tag name is the paragraph. The name is the class attribute. So my bug was that I was using the wrong method. Name, get elements by name is selecting on the name attribute. In other words, you know, you might have a input tag that you give a name. Well, we're not doing that. Get elements by tag name is what I'm looking for. Selects elements by their element name. Get elements by tag name. So we're selecting by the paragraphs. There's the first paragraph. There's the second paragraph. There's the third paragraph. There's the fourth paragraph. Okay, so you could see that we're selecting an array of elements. Because it's an array, you can access them with their index. This would be paragraph sub 0, paragraph sub 1, paragraph sub 2, paragraph sub 3. So that's a good demonstration of get elements by tag name. And these other methods work the same way, but it's working by selecting them by their attributes and not the actual tag. Then we can start working with attributes a little bit. And so common methods of the element interface. So if you select, what this is saying, this element interface, is that if you select an element, then you can work with these methods. If you select the document by coding document, you can work with these methods up here. But you can also work with these methods up here by selecting an element. Okay, so it doesn't have to be document get element by tag name. You could select a paragraph, and then inside of that paragraph, you could get elements by the tag name inside of that paragraph instead of selecting the entire document. So that's what they're talking about on the interface. It's really talking about what do you select, and if you're what you're selecting, you have different options to work with, different methods. Since down here we're selecting, since we're working with paragraphs, we're working with elements, we can work with these methods. And so you can set an attribute. So this is actually pretty neat. Any HTML element, you can set an attribute and give it a value. So let's do this. Let's make a style. Let's make a class selector just called red. So this is a CSS line of code. Right now, none of these have a class of red. Instead of just reading Okay, so now we're going to do this. Instead of doing it on page load, I'll do it on a button click. So that's pretty quick way to do that. And now paragraphs sub I dot set attribute. And you can see that set attribute takes two values, the name of the attribute and the value of the attribute. And so real quick forward, you can see you put both in quotes. And so the HTML attribute of class, so we're gonna, on each paragraph, we're gonna add a class, and the name of the class is going to be red. So we're gonna select all of the paragraphs, we'll loop through and add the class of red to our paragraphs. So paragraphs load, turn colors on. Again, not like I'm doing some sort of like magic here, but as we're tying these pieces together, I think it's a pretty neat thing, because that's ultimately what JavaScript does for us, is it allows us to make more dynamic pages. So we're getting pretty close. To piecing this all together. Now, has attribute is a method that will return true or false. And so you could say if paragraphs sub 0 has an attribute of class, All right, just showing you how it could be used, because has attribute will return true or false. You could see there at the end there it says Boolean. So you can use that inside of an if statement. And of course, once we add the class attribute, then that should return true, and you get the first paragraph has a class attribute. So it adds it first, and then of course it returns true inside of that if statement. Okay, now we're kind of at the point here where they demonstrate some of this stuff where it has attribute, set attribute. I'm at the point where I want you guys to do a little bit of coding yourself. But instead of kind of demonstrating all these little pieces here, I've got one more piece of information, and then I'm gonna have you guys do some coding. And so this next slide that I want to cover, here you can see there's a remove attribute as well. So just how I added an attribute by doing set attribute, we could also remove it with remove attribute. And so real quick, I can if paragraph has an attribute, then let's remove attribute of class. So it will it'll take the class attribute back off, and then that first link will stay black because it doesn't have the class attribute. So we added it, but then we removed it. Obviously happened so fast you didn't see it. It's not like you could see one before the other, it just happens instantly. Okay, the challenges behind what we've learned so far, probably the hardest thing to get familiar with, and again, you saw me make this mistake myself, is that you don't just target the parent element like the H1. You have to then say it's child node, and then you can work with the individual text. So just remembering that the text is a node itself is a common mistake, as I demonstrated. So what we've learned so far, this is called the DOM Core Specification. And so anytime we're talking about uh, the um, the methods of the document interface and the methods of the element interface, that's all built into what's called the DOM Core Specification. And again, I call that the kind of like the older, slightly more syntax heavy approach. And so there is a different specification called the DOM HTML specification. And the benefit of the DOM HTML specification is, like right now, if we want to add an attribute, there's all these methods: has attribute, get attribute, set attribute, remove attribute. And so they kind of simplify this a little bit. They kind of simplify this in the HTML specification with using a lot of properties. And if it's an attribute in the HTML, there's a property that is associated with it in the JavaScript. And so, for example, I would change this simply to say the HTML attribute, right? And over here, this is the JavaScript property. And so you could see here that, like, just for class, well, in the core specification, when you're working with classes, I mean, how many methods are there that we just said? There's a whole bunch of methods: get attribute, has attribute, get attribute, set attribute, remove attribute. Um, they really just clean it up, and it makes it easier to code. So in the HTML, if you have an ID attribute, you can reference the ID attribute in JavaScript. And that's on any HTML element. So if you select any HTML element and you want to give it an ID, you just simply select it with getElementById, .id equals, and then you can assign it a value. The class then is done with the class name. The only ones like the href attribute stays href, the source attribute remains source, alt remains alt, disabled is disabled. The ones that are unique are class name and tag name. And so if I change this code, like let me show you by example. And I'll kind of comment this one out here or remove it. Instead of using this right here, set attribute as part of that core specification, you would just say class name equals red. And so this is a cleaner syntax to add a class to all of our paragraphs. Okay, again, this is the HTML core HTML specification. So again, what's easier? Well, dot class name, I would argue, is quite a bit easier than dot set attribute and then passing it two values into a method. Okay, so you do get a little bit of overlap there, but the syntax is easier, and so it's pretty nice. You know, if we had an image tag with an ID of some image, source equals, I don't think I have any images hanging out in this repo. We could simply, to change the source attribute of our image in our JavaScript, again, there's a source attribute here that we're all very familiar with. And let's just download two images to show you how easy it is to swap out images. I just started watching this damn popular show on Netflix. So that's just what came to mind. Let's go to images. So I got one.png and I don't want that. I don't like that file extension, JFIF. Of course, all my JPEGs are going to be JFIF now. Okay, whatever, it works. Okay, so we'll load up one.png, and then of course we're still going to turn colors using the class name equals red. But then now let's target our image, document get element by ID, some image dot source attribute. Again, super easy. You know how to change it here. You know how to change it here. 2.jfif. So you click the button, it's going to change the colors and swap out an image. So here's one, there's two. So again, benefit here of this HTML specification is it takes the HTML that you already know and just makes it a JavaScript property. So all you have to do is select the right element and then work with the properties that you already know. Not to say the core specification isn't also a valid way or valid, use of, making these pages dynamic. It's simply that it's a little bit easier, this HTML specification. Okay, and so they show you here on, using the core specification, how you might swap an image, with these 3 lines, and then really how easy it is with the HTML specification. Really just this one line is all you need. Okay, and then they just do some other examples by using the ID attribute, the href attribute of your links. Again, class name is the one that's a little bit unique. Instead of .class, it's .class name, and instead of .tag, it's .tag name. But really, the class name is a pretty useful one. And you can enable and disable things with the disabled property. So all of your elements that can be disabled, like if you target a button in your form, you can disable the button. All right. So again, the document object model, just kind of review this real quick, and I'm going to have you guys write some code. The document object model, it's a picture of the HTML document what is it a picture of? It's a picture of objects, which objects, aka nodes, and the nodes, as we know, are your individual elements and the text and the attribute nodes or the document node. And so there's 4 kinds of nodes in the DOM. The core specification is the slightly harder syntax that you have to select an element and then select its child and use all those methods. It can be slightly harder syntax to write. An interface is a list of methods or properties that belong to an element or to a document. And so that's what an interface is. An interface basically says, these are the methods and properties that apply to these things, are the different interfaces. DOM scripting is literally just the JavaScript that we write to manipulate our HTML. And then the HTML specification is the easier syntax way of writing JavaScript to manipulate our HTML. Okay, in your book, there is a FAQ application where you begin to manipulate the HTML. It's in the chapter, in chapter 6, and I think now's a good time for you guys to actually write a little bit of code. So I'm going to pause the recording here, and we're going to write some code. Okay, went ahead and resumed. So we got a chance to write some code. Quite honestly, the rest of, we've covered the bulk. We've covered the bulk of this PowerPoint. I can cover the rest of this, I think, fairly quickly. In that, again, learning to work with the DOM in the methods and the properties that we've covered in this chapter is a majority of the work. Where we left off was a little bit back talking about HTML forms, and so we've covered HTML forms in the HTML book. And so if you really look at the material from slides 25 you know, 28, we've covered that, 29, that's all from, the chapter of the HTML book. We know what a form is, we know what controls are, we know what the submit button is, reset, data validation, we know all of that. We've also worked with text boxes and text areas and select objects. And keep in mind the select object is the drop down list that has options. So you have a select tag, and then inside of the select tag, you have option tag. And all of these things, text box, your text area, and your drop down list, they all have a value property. And again, so, we've done this. We've got user input from the value of a text box. We've done something with that and then put it back on the output. And so we've already been doing this in this class. And so you got some HTML here with some text box for a username, a text area for a comment, and a drop-down list which says, select your country, USA, Canada, or Mexico. And then they just write a little bit of JavaScript where you can read the text box name, read the text area, the value of the text area, read the name of the text box, and then read the value of the country. Now keep in mind, these values are actually stored down in the option tag. So you have the option value USA. This value is what's used in the JavaScript. And then USA with caps, that's what the user sees. And so CAN is what you can code against. MEX is what you can code against. When you read the value, you're reading the value attribute. And so you'll notice in the JavaScript here, they're coding their if-else's against USA, CAN, and MEX because that's where you're getting the value from, the value attribute. And so really all they did here was a little bit of validation. They say basically if none of these are true, if the country is not USA, else if it's not Canada, else if it's not Mexico, you give a little alert to the user saying please select a country because it's not one of the options that has been selected. All right. Read operations. Again, what's on the left of the equal sign is what's changing. In this case, what's on the left of the equal sign is a variable, and we're setting the variable equal to the value from the text box. If you flip that around, you put the value on the left-hand side, we're changing the value attribute of the country, the ID of country equal to blank. Now let's see what the ID of country is. The ID of country is the actual select tag. So if you set the select tag value equal to blank, that's going to be this first option right here. That's no option. Basically, the first option is no option selected. Okay, we could do the same thing. We can blank out a text box by doing an empty string, and you could blank out a text area by setting the value equal to an empty string. A couple of properties for radio and checkbox objects. So if you select a radio button or you select a checkbox, you can read the value or you can read to see if it's checked. That'll be the checked property will be true or false. The value will give you, again, very similar to the drop-down list. The value is stored in the tag as the the attribute. So the input that says email has a value attribute of lowercase email. The text box, or no, not the text box, what do we have? Input type of radio. This radio button has a value of text, T-E-X-T, but then what the user sees is a capital text. So again, the value is what you code against in the JavaScript. What's outside of the tag is what the user sees. And so again, the checked attribute says, hey, if this checkbox is checked, then you do this. If this checkbox is checked or this radio button is checked, then you can do that. So nothing too crazy difficult there. You can use JavaScript to actually make check marks. Normally, you let the users make the check marks. But if you ever need to, you can use the check property to actually check a box or uncheck a box. So you can see there if you set it to false, that'll take a checkbox that's checked and uncheck it. And so if you want to like reset a form, you could uncheck all your checkboxes. Question is, if there is no value attribute, is the value for text inside of the tag? No, you have to set the value attribute to reference it in the JavaScript. So it has to be the value attribute if you're going to work with the JavaScript. And then some things that you can do with a form. Obviously these are value attributes and checked attributes. And again, that checked attribute stores a piece of information, whether the checkbox is checked. Some behaviors that a form can do, like some methods, would be the submit method and a reset method. And so when a user clicks a submit button, not just a regular button, but if they click a submit button, it submits the form. Well, if you don't have a submit button, if you have a normal button, an HTML input type of button, you can get that regular HTML button to do a submit by calling the submit method. And so what you might normally do is you might normally code a normal button, validate the data first, and then if the data is valid, then you submit the form to the server. Okay, but if the data isn't valid, then you do not submit the form. So it's like a big if. If it's valid, then you submit it. Else, tell the user that what the problem is so they can fix it. You can also focus and blur controls, which I'm not mistaken. Again, we've worked with that. There's an event on focus, which the event on focus says, okay, once this control receives focus, then run some JavaScript, run your event handler. Okay. Then there's the focus method, which says, okay, once you're in an event handler, you're doing something, you want a control to receive focus, you can call the focus method to put the focus on that text box. Or remove focus, which is the opposite of focus, is blur, which is, the cursor goes away from the text box. Instead of focusing it, it goes away. Okay, so again, making sure you understand there's a difference between the method of focus, which puts focus on a control, and on focus, which is an event that occurs, and you can run JavaScript when events occur. Okay, and these are all, we've already done a lab on all of these: on focus, on blur, on click. Every time I read that, I think of like Santa Claus or something. On focus, on blur, on click, on dasher, on dancer, whatever it is. Okay, the way that you call the submit and the reset function is by targeting the form tag itself. And so in the HTML, you target the actual form tag and you tell the form to submit or the form to reset. Okay, there's an example of a blur. Clearing out a text box by setting that text box to an empty string. Wiring up a bunch of handlers on load, which is where you want to wire up your event handlers. Okay, which really, that brings us to the end of this lecture, just about. There's another coding chunk that I'm going to have you guys do, which is this register application, just for practice. It's not for a grade. So I'm going to come back to this. Let's see if there's anything else here. This is a third application. I'm not going to have you code this one. If you want to, you can, but for practice, let's see. It's just a bunch of more code examples. Yeah, that's pretty much the end of the lecture. So the next step for you guys, I'm going to stop this recording. The next step for you guys is to find this register application in your textbook. Code the HTML, code the CSS, code the JavaScript. This is just for practice. Okay. Stop recording.